Welcome to Project HeadCanon. This is the 8th video of the Content Crosshair series, where we take a look at pieces of Star Wars media and determine how canonical they should be in this project. In our sights today, we've got one of the first Star Wars television series ever made. That's right, before The Mandalorian, before Rebels, before the Clone Wars, before any of that, there were the... It's a pretty catchy song, isn't it? Alright. The series begins sometime before the events of Return of the Jedi, before the Empire made its presence known on Endor. The plot of each episode follows a kind of familiar pattern. There's an A-plot regarding some external threat to the Ewok society, and a B-plot involving some minor drama amongst the Ewoks themselves. The A-plots often involve the Duloks, a previously unseen type of monster, this Tolga witch named Morag, or at the end of the series, the Empire. The B-plots often involve Wicket trying to prove himself as a warrior, Teebo learning magic from Logray, and the occasional love triangle. The two plots are introduced separately in an episode, but they are always resolved together. There's not much of a through line to the story, though they do seem to follow a somewhat chronological order. One odd decision was to kill off Morag, the closest thing to a season antagonist, in episode 9 of 13 in season 1. This magical artifact called the Sunstar drives the plots of a lot of later episodes, though they remain disconnected from each other mostly. My favorite episode was the very last one, which marks what I believe to be the first in-universe contact between the Empire, represented by Dr. Rhaegar here, and the Ewok tribe. Rhaegar steals the Sunstar, and the Ewoks steal it back. Meanwhile, Latara learns a lesson in reciprocal kindness from a sympathetic Imperial droid called PD-28, who eventually helps the Ewoks escape. Though it's the only episode to feature the Empire, it's otherwise a pretty good example of the episodic formula. And were it not for the two films that take place in between, it would be a nice segue into the Empire's occupation of Endor and the events of Return of the Jedi. On that note, let's start by placing the show in its historical context. So in 1984, Return of the Jedi had just come out, ending the original trilogy. George Lucas decided to focus the next part of the Star Wars franchise on the Ewoks of Endor, and to primarily market the franchise towards children. Though a few children's books preceded it, I'd argue that the release of the TV movie Caravan of Courage is really what kicked off the Ewoks franchise. The first episode of the Ewoks TV series aired the following year, as did a TV movie sequel to Caravan of Courage called Ewoks: The Battle for Endor. In the late 80s, the Ewoks franchise basically was Star Wars. There wasn't much new Star Wars material being published that wasn't somehow related to Ewoks, and this series was the centerpiece of it. So, what of the show itself? Well, as a children's series, it's pretty alright. It's very episodic, with not much in the way of a series arc. The individual plots aren't super tight either, but that leaves a lot of room to explore the Endor ecosystem and Ewok culture. In fact, I think this show's world-building is one of its strongest features. I'm left wondering about the evolutionary history of the Ewoks and Duloks, and how differently Return of the Jedi would have turned out if the rebels decided to land in a patch of forest inhabited by, say, these guys, or these guys. I think the Star Wars universe makes a very interesting backdrop for what would otherwise be a pretty generic fantasy setting, and still allows for quite a bit of creative freedom on the part of the writers. Problems arise, as they so often do, when that creativity starts to supersede the overall Star Wars-ness of the universe. It's one thing to make a fantasy series with strange creatures and magic, but placing that series in the Star Wars universe means you have to be a lot more careful not to break things, especially when we already have a live-action representation of Endor in Return of the Jedi. Granted, I doubt anyone at the time was as continuity-minded as I'm being right now, and I don't think the show would be any better in its own right if they made it conform rigidly to our modern definitions of canon. That said, here are the most major continuity problems that the show introduces. So of course, in Return of the Jedi, the language barrier between Basic and Ewokese is a pretty important plot point. In the show, the Ewoks and most other denizens of Endor speak English with a few Ewokese loanwords. We could parse this as the show translating non-diegetically for the audience, but we also see Ewoks communicating with both the other species on Endor and an Imperial scientist. You could argue that the Imperials in the show are also fluent in Ewokese, but that's a bit of a stretch compared to what we know from Return of the Jedi. The show also plays pretty fast and loose with the concept of magic. We see various powers being used by certain characters, including telekinesis, transubstantiation, plant control, weather control, and a few that are a bit harder to describe. Of course, this is Star Wars, where magic, in the typical sense, is almost always a manifestation of the Force. but not much of the magic in the show is consistent with the Force as described in other Star Wars media. Moreover, if Logray was half as powerful in the Force as he is in the show, surely Luke's demonstration in Return of the Jedi would not have gotten the response it did from the Ewoks. Though the world building is pretty good, there are a few bits of it that conflict with what we see in Return of the Jedi. For example, in these shots, we don't see much space for the various biomes that we see in the show. For scale, Endor is only 4,900 kilometers in diameter, which gives it about 15% the surface area of Earth. So overall, I feel the same way about this series that I do about Star Tours. On one hand, I don't really see how to fit the show's plot into the rest of Star Wars, what with the Ewoks speaking basic, the seemingly non-Force related magic, and the contradictions with Return of the Jedi. On the other, there's a lot of world building here that I don't see any harm in keeping, especially world building that's been corroborated by other pieces of Star Wars media. With that in mind, I initially assigned the Ewoks TV series a canonicity value of 0.1, putting it on par with the Star Tours rides, and then I got to work making the first cuts and edits. I quickly realized that the cutting process would be long and arduous, since I had to decide for each appearance what should be kept and what shouldn't, and I had to do that for every single episode of both seasons of the show. On top of that, every episode was listed separately in each page's appearances section, which meant I had to revisit the same pages a lot. On top of that, compilations of Ewoks episodes were also released as TV movies themselves, which for some reason are listed as separate appearances. On top of that, a lot of individual episodes also have novelizations that I had to keep track of. And on top of that, some articles only cite the show as a whole, rather than any individual episodes, making it nearly impossible to tell exactly where the subjects of the articles appear. It got very frustrating very quickly. And in the end, for the sake of my own sanity, I gave in to my frustration, let the hate flow through me, and altered my final verdict to just cut the Ewoks TV series entirely. Even without stopping to consider each individual appearance, this was by far the longest, most extensive, and most frustrating cutting process so far. In total, I manually deleted 1,079 pages, of which 565 were images and audio files, and I edited another 1,316 articles. The main reason that this was so much work is that everything within the Ewoks franchise is so interrelated. I can't help but feel that I've made a mistake looking at just the TV show and its direct tie-ins right now. The vast majority of articles that I edited but did not delete appeared both in the show and in Caravan of Courage, Ewoks the Battle for Endor, or one of the other comic or children's book series. It may very well be that, once I take a look at the rest of the franchise, most of those edited articles are going to end up getting cut as well, which would render most of the time I've spent here unnecessary. In the meantime, here's a list of all the material I cut. Well, that took way longer than I think it had to, and now I'm feeling really burnt out. I would jump right into the remaining Ewoks material for the next video, since the state I've left the wiki in right now feels awfully incomplete, but I feel like I need a break from it, at least for a while. But you know, I'm honestly not sure what to do in the meantime. I'm kind of apathetic.
Apathy is death.
Well, okay then. If that's the case, may the Force be with you.